Okay, we'd like to go ahead and welcome everyone to our webinar today, Equity in Public Management. Today's discussion will feature discussions on integrating equity and performance management can drive meaningful change in public service. Our speakers today include Michael Jacobson, Deputy Director of Performance and Strategy at King County, and Ben Jacob, Director of Community Development of the Community Development Institute at the Washington University of Wisconsin. This webinar is brought to you by the American Society of Public Administration and the National Center for Public Performance at Suffolk University. We do have a few housekeeping items before we begin. All attendees will remain muted with their cameras off for the duration of the presentation. If you'd like to submit a question for the speakers, you may do so at any time using the chat or the questions tab found on your dashboard. If you'd like to submit a question anonymously, please use the chat feature and send a direct message to the administrator, Caitlin Keegan, and note that the question is to be asked anonymously. At the conclusion of the presentation, the moderator will read off the questions and answers to the speakers for their response. Today's webinar will be recorded and available to all members to access in your online digital library. If you're not a member of ASPA, our webinar library is a great reason to join. Please email membership@aspanet.org to register and begin enjoying all the benefits of an ASPA membership. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over here to Stephanie to begin the presentation. Thank you so much for attending.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Stephanie Bensadoun. I'm the Associate Director at the National Center for Public Performance. To tell you a little bit about NCPP, we strive to improve performance in the public sector through research, consulting, and building a global network of professionals, practitioners, and scholars in the public sector. We offer consulting services and customized training programs for public and nonprofit organizations to improve performance and efficiency. If you'd like to learn more about our services, please email us at ncpp@suffolk.edu. But otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I am thrilled to introduce, although we've kind of already done it, but introduce our expert guest today, Michael Jacobson. Again, the Deputy Director of Performance and Strategy at King County Office of Performance Strategy and Budget in Seattle, Washington, and Benoit Jacob, the Director of the Community Development Institute at the University of Wisconsin. Let's begin with you guys introducing yourself. So, Michael, would you like to kick it off for us?
Sure. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a ASPA member and active with NCCP and other groups within ASPA, and really excited to be here today to share some of my personal and professional journey around equity with King County. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for having me here. Super excited. It's super excited to share the webinar with Michael, who actually, when I first started working in this space around equity, about feels like 15 years ago or so, I guess, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Michael was one of the first to sort of introduce me to the field. So it's a real pleasure to sort of, and we've had a chance to connect over the years, but this is a nice opportunity to sort of come full circle a bit with Michael. So thanks for having me, and excited to chat with you all today.
Thank you both so much. So we'll start with some questions for you, and then we'll go to a Q&A closer to the end, where anybody in the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, in the questions chat, and we'll make sure to ask them to our speakers. But first off, can you each begin by laying out a bit of context for your work in equity in public administration?
Sure. So maybe I'll take a stab at that first. So I actually, so my interest in the world of public administration largely revolves around the work of local governments. So I tell people that I'm fundamentally interested in the growth and governance of cities. Michael and I were actually chatting the other day, and one of the places that's particularly interesting for me is how local governments are become increasingly involved in places that they hadn't really been involved with in before, for a variety of reasons. Local governments had a fairly constrained space of work. More recently, for a range of reasons, local governments have been active in the world of equity. And so I didn't consider myself an equity scholar. I considered myself a scholar of local governments. as such, as local governments have become increasingly involved in equity, I've become increasingly interested in it myself. And so, paying a lot of attention on how local governments are addressing the challenge, how they're trying to think creatively about how to reshape their programs. And so, that's been the focus of my work. And I'm just going to put in the chat here a link to uh, the paper that I wrote about 4 years ago for the ICMA, the International City County Managers Association, and that really reflects, I think, my current work certainly, but my most comprehensive work around how local governments are implementing equity efforts in their organizations. So I think that gives a little bit of context, Michael.
Yeah, I would say I'm a little bit of a late adopter in this arena. My first part of my career was around environmental issues, and although environmental disproportionate impacts on communities was noted, environmental justice issues, it wasn't an area that I particularly worked in. And then when I got into working with King County, it was just 22 years ago now, I came into a natural resource and parks department. And there are clearly equity issues in that department, but it was really only when I came into the exec's office, executive Ron Sims, who really came from a community organizing perspective, African American leader in King County, and he created a equity and social justice initiative. This is back in 2008, and there had been projects that had been bubbling along, but that initiative really kind of got the county thinking in a whole county perspective about how we should be looking at equity issues, social justice issues from a public management, public administration perspective. I've been involved in countywide strategic planning, countywide performance management. That's really been my lane. And so how we then started integrating these equity concepts into our countywide strategic plan. There was an Office of Equity and Social Justice created. There was some initial work around creating determinants of equity. And I always saw the opportunity and the role for data and measurement as a key supporting function for the equity policy arena. So we talked about many different topics in equity. And I always thought that data was an essential element to understand what are the biggest opportunities, what are the biggest disparities, how should we be thinking about this from an analytical planning perspective. And then the actual solutions can also be informed by data. And the data doesn't only have to be quantitative. So qualitative data, I think, is also critical. Community perspective on what are the most important issues becomes part of any good strategic planning process, for example. So when we saw this kind of convergence of quantitative and qualitative data, those became important planks, if you will, in our county-wide strategic plan. That the county has continued to evolve its approach on this. And I think the first equity and social justice strategic plan, a government-wide one, may have been from King County. I think that is one of our claims to fame. And we are in the process of revising that. We can talk about this a little bit later, but we're in the process of updating that equity and social justice. It's now equity, racial, and social justice strategic plan. And so by supporting the work, by championing the work that we can do in our kind of office, our budget office, an OMB type office, has been incredibly, I think it's been powerful, but also at a very personal level, it's been just incredibly rewarding to see this integration of equity concepts into traditional public management approaches.
Thank you. How can public service organizations integrate equity into their performance management frameworks effectively? Benoit.
Yeah, super. Um, so, so like I said, I'll anchor most of my comments and thoughts in the ICMA report that I drafted, because it's actually captured, I think, a little bit of attention, anyways. And so, in that particular report, the way I think about and the way I describe the way public service organizations integrate equity is first and foremost by thinking about their organization from a framework of organizational change. So equity when I started that report and I interviewed public administrators, I asked them a lot about, tell me about your equity program, right? That was my beginning of this, was to help to understand equity program. And the response I got back almost universally was, actually, Benoit, we don't think about equity programming per se. What we think about is equity as a totally different way of doing business. And so the efforts of integrating equity is really about changing fundamentally the way the nitty gritty day to day activities are undertaken. And so what that means for many public organizations is really rethinking the systems overall. So starting and looking at the organization as a whole, and so what it means to change the organization from the lens of equity. And so in the report, then I put together, based on the feedback I received from a lot of public administrators and equity officers working in the space, particularly around local governments, is a four-phased framework for organizational change around equity. And so we know, of course, it's not linear, but if you were to think about it linearly, there's an initiation phase where organizations take some time to think about how equity is integrated in their vision and mission. That vision and mission then drives a lot of the direction of the organization. The next phase would be to really start integrating people in the organization in what it means to do equity on a day-to-day basis. So what are the skills and tools that are required? What are some pilot programs that can start within departments to advance equity? This is where some of the initial performance measures might be tested and explored. And then the big work, developing the infrastructure around. So a phase 3 would be developing the infrastructure in an organization. So Michael's King County, I think, has a lot of this in place as a result of the work that they've been doing. So there you're looking at things like equity teams in departments, equity officers that a lot of organizations are currently hiring and have been hiring for some years now. And then, of course, developing the related data systems that track performance in equity terms. And then the fourth phase would be sort of sustaining equity. And this is largely about developing the deep relationships within the organization and external to the organization that will sustain equity efforts across time. I think what's important about this framework, though, is that it really is an effort to take the idea of equity and make it as tangible as one can through organizational change. It is less focused, and maybe deliberately so, on what we might think of as the traditional DEI training, which has a role, but it's less about changing individual perspectives per se, as much as turning the lens on what are those organizational systems. So from my perspective, the question is integrating equity. It really is about looking at the day-to-day operations and how we can work through the steps of organizational change to make public organizations effectively integrate equity on those day-to-day basis.
I really enjoyed the work that Benoit did for that ICMA report. It was elucidating, even though we were interviewed for part of it, but we sort of saw ourselves in the mirror in a new way, and having that structure be sort of an exoskeleton, if you will, for how we thought about some of our work was reinforcing. I would say this is a long journey. There's not a beginning, middle, and end. And so even though Benoit talks about these steps, I always sort of jokingly say that it's more like the old board game of chutes and ladders than it is about a single linear road race. It's not, there is a beginning and an end to a road race. Chutes and ladders, you climb up and then you slide back down. So there are elements in here around training. There's elements here around our standard work. There's even, to me, there's almost a philosophy of establishing structures of internal advocacy, different than external advocacy. External advocacy is always going to exist with community groups and other elected officials. But I think a role of an equity office, for example, can be a sanctioned internal advocacy function. So, for example, in our first equity and social justice strategic plan, in that plan, we called out what we needed to be doing internally to achieve our equity goals. So there were lots of direction to us around our planning and monitoring and budgeting work that we might have gotten to on our own, but the fact that these ideas were coming from community, coming from our employees, getting kind of rolled up into that strategic plan direction was a very strong and compelling case for why we need to be doing the work. I would say that training is critical, and it's hard to only talk about kind of organizational and structural change if you don't have people thinking about equity from a personal and interpersonal perspective. If you have four people sitting around a table doing an equity impact review process, and they're all the same race and they have no exposure to any, there's no difference among them, the results of that equity impact review will be very different than if you have a more diverse group of people with various life experiences. So tapping into people's personal journey is an important piece. It's often the part where we get a lot of pushback. People like, you're telling me how to think, et cetera. It's not really about that. It is really just about understanding different, looking at the world with a slightly different perspective sometimes. I'm speaking as a white person now. I think, if you're a person of color, you don't need some of this training. Some of the training doesn't land all that well on you or is traumatizing. But I do think it's really important for everyone to have a basic common understanding about what we're talking about when we talk about equity. We argued about what equity meant for far too long. I think you can shortcut that and get to a cleaner, more operational definition that can move things along. I also think embedding these things into your standard work. So my team is responsible for planning and monitoring at the enterprise level, and so building in steps in the planning process, calling out, for equity specific uh, objectives. Many of us have heard of SMART goals. Well, there's now SMARTY goals where you've got, inclusive and equity as part of that acronym. And so there's different ways of doing that, looking at the data that you're looking at and looking for differential targets perhaps, or, expectations for how the program is going to land. I think those are also important. We've tried to weave in, or braid is the word I sometimes use, equity concepts throughout our enterprise planning and monitoring work. So for example, we have a set of county values. One of those values is explicitly equity, and there's a bunch of behaviors and frames that we use to talk about that. We have equity embedded in our goals and our objectives and our measures. So it's not necessarily over there on the side. There's some of that, but I think a lot of it we've tried to build into the systems that we have. We have we have now, one of the concepts that we have is to be a best run government. And this is a framing that came from our current county executive, Dow Constantine. And we have what's called a roadmap. It started as a maturity model, and we did not originally have equity concepts embedded in that best run government roadmap. And we have gone through a number of iterations of that and evolved that so that equity is now a key part of those management expectations. And it talks about vision, planning, monitoring, continuous improvement, and there's now equity criteria in there for you to advance from there's a 1 through 4 scale. In order to move up the scale, you have to be achieving some of these equity concepts, including things like disaggregating your data, things like that. So it's not explicitly an equity roadmap. It's not explicitly an equity maturity model, but it embeds those equity concepts into our management philosophy and our thinking.
Hey, Michael, can I jump in? I want to ask you a question. I'm going to go off
Sure.
script here a little bit. Sorry,
Love it.
Stephanie, if I'm taking us off script, but only because you mentioned the chutes and ladders, and we talked about it yesterday. I've been thinking a little bit about it. So in the ICMA report, part of what makes the organizational change management framework work is if there's a culture also of organizational learning. But that's kind of abstract, and I'm just curious in your idea of chutes and ladders. It means you're going to have a success and you're going to have a failure. You're going to have a success and failure. Um, in sort of real terms, as best you can, how does that learning occur around equity? Because if I have a concern about integrating equity, It's that once the first failure comes, there's no learning, and
You quit.
so it
Yeah.
stops. And so
Yeah.
how does it actually take place in King County?
Well, I think I'm not sure if my answer will be specific enough for you, but I feel like the broad scale education. We did a lot of equity training for many leaders. Anyone that was a people leader, anyone that was a division manager, they received quite a bit of training, in those early years to clarify what the concept was and to clarify what the overall goal was. So if you have an overall goal, you can have a setback, but your goal is still there. It just means you're adopting a different strategy, or you're trying to assess it. I think leadership visibility on this issue is critical. I think if the leader lets go of this, with any initiative, frankly, it's easy for that initiative to falter and die. I think the equity work is essential for the leader to speak in personal terms what it means to them, what it means to the community. And so we have created essentially layers of advocates, and I'll say small advocates, or champions might be a more palatable term in government, where the words are embedded in so many parts of our structure. Like I said, our county values, it's in our True North statement, it's in many of the goals of our key initiatives. And so you might get a setback, but the overall structure is still compelling you to go back and figure it out. And so, yes, we don't like having setbacks. We don't like having failures or projects that don't, get completed. But it happens. And so just acknowledging that the overall directionality is the same. And maybe it means we recast and we regroup. We've had at one point we had an inter-department team of equity leads. Then we created an inter-branch team of equity leads. So there was someone from every single department, every single office, and including the courts and separately elected agencies, sat around on a monthly basis and talked about the challenges and struggles that they had around equity, and that became a place of connection and shared learning. And it was really around that table where the original concept for the ESJ strategic plan, the determinants of equity work, was born, because we all saw the need for some more collective direction, that we're all doing our individual things, but and doing fine things, but just collectively we weren't having the impact that we wanted to have. So the first strategic plan was born in that environment. And then office was created, and more resources were put forward. Now we have an equity, inclusion, and belonging manager in most departments in the county. That's at the department scale. Sometimes they're even in the divisions as well. And I've seen a similar growth of skills and advocates for performance measurement and best run government kinds of activities. I can say all I want about how to measure performance, but if a department doesn't have a trained staff person leading some of that effort at the department level, it's a lot of hot air. So, having the resources, at the department level for us has also been a critical piece. Those equity, inclusion, belonging managers get together on a regular basis. So again, there's like networks of people in my office in PSB, which is, I don't know, 80 people. We have a equity social justice team. It's made up of people that are just interested, and we get together on a regular basis. We're meeting later today. We're going to talk about what's on our to-do list and what we need to do to keep equity visible. So again, this is part of everyone's job. Some people take it more seriously; they get on board, but again, creating the infrastructure, I think, is a key part to sustaining it.
Thanks. Sorry, Stephanie, for derailing you.
No, you can always derail. Thank you both. I think this is a really great segue to our next question. Benoit, you talked about the framework and integrating equity in organizations, and Michael, you've brought in like your unique experience in implementing or weaving in equity concepts, like you mentioned. And can you go a little deeper into what are some of the practical challenges that agencies face when attempting to incorporate equity into their performance management systems?
Sure, I'll jump in quick because I'll have a relatively quick answer, I think. I mean, to some degree, and I think Michael, it's great to have his expertise here. One of the things that I think a lot of jurisdictions struggle with, though, is that King County is so far ahead on this, right? And so, one of the real practical challenges that I think a lot of the jurisdictions I've spoken to deal with is first just sheer capacity, right? So the things Michael talked about, having an officer in each department, an equity officer in each department, having a team, having the time to sit down and have these conversations. A lot of jurisdictions just aren't there yet, and that capacity is very often the limiting factor. And so, what that capacity looks like is harder to say, right? I mean, it's resources in the very most fundamental sense. It's money to hire people into these positions. It's also taking the time, right? Finding the time on people's already very full schedules to sit down and do training to understand the overall objective. It's the time to engage with community to understand what the needs are and what the equity vision for the organization ought to look like. So capacity is really the first and foremost really practical thing that I think places a barrier up. Once that capacity is kind of overcome, I think Michael's point as well about leadership is critical. One of the leadership visibility on this is tremendously important, but one of the lessons I think, and I think Michael sort of points to it in the different groups that are integrated throughout the organization. So leadership visibility is important, but it's not just leadership at the highest level. It's actually leadership throughout the whole organization, right? So having advocates, champions, as Michael says, throughout the organization are really fundamental, I think, to moving equity along. So to me, it's that capacity and that leadership throughout the whole organization that helps. That can either be your thing that moves it forward or the challenge that sort of holds you back.
So I'm going to say +1 to everything that Benoit said, even though we're King County. And you might say, yeah, you've been doing, you have these resources, but we've been working on it since 2008.
Yeah.
And every government, every leader has an agenda when they come in. And most people in most departments look at that agenda as an add-on, as an annoyance, as something that they are going to try to survive. I mean, maybe even if it resonates with people, they're like, oh, that sounds great. How am I going to do that? How am I going to make the time for this? And so whether it's performance measurement and best run government kinds of things, or it's equity, social justice types of things, there are a lot of parallels for the struggles that we've had in trying to get the leadership support. This is not the executive level leadership. The leaders have been very supportive, but then department level leadership, division level leadership, section level leadership, building that leadership support all the way down the organization. It is a massive change management challenge, and to go into it assuming that because the executive or the mayor or whatever is like, oh, this is a good idea, the work has just begun. The starting gun has just gone off. So I think the capacity challenge has to be reframed in a way. And yes, we do have some people that are dedicated to this. It's true. But I would say that training people to understand what their opportunities are to influence this work from where they sit is one of the biggest opportunities and challenges, because almost everyone can do something to improve, let's say, measurement, in their work, or the equity analysis of their work. It doesn't need a 0.25 FTE to do that if everyone has some basic skills and abilities. So now, if you give me a hammer, I know how to hit a nail in. If you give me a blowtorch, I won't know what to do with it. So, you have to skill the right level of person with the right level of tool. It's really helpful to have someone in the county with a blowtorch ability, right? But that's not me. That's our equity office. They come in with a blowtorch level of skill, and they know the safety precautions. They know what can and can't be done. I'm out here with my hammer and my screwdriver doing basic home repairs, so there's like a level of um, kind of appropriate training and appropriate expectations for each person in the organization. So that's one thing. I do think that sustained political support is something that we have been very blessed with. I have been at the county for 22 years, and I've had count them, two county executives. Very long tenured leadership, very committed to equity and measurement and management issues. So I am blessed. I think if I had more turmoil, more turnover, it's very hard to sustain either one of these types of programs effectively. Um, Lastly, I already alluded to it, but I think we argued about what equity meant for a long time, and that's a place of privilege that you can spend so much time arguing about it. It's kind of a way of pushing back too. But even among people that were committed to the concept of equity, what did it mean? Who was included? Was there someone that was excluded? Was racial equity, gonna, you know, unprivileged folks, who are LGBTQ and feel like they were more marginalized if we emphasized racial equity, for example. So there were real internal debates about how we define it. We've come to greater clarity about that, and I think we've been able to move on in many regards. I one last the other sorry, I had one more thought. I'm going to have to come back to it though.
No worries. Speaking of tools, what are some tools and methodologies that public service agencies can use to embed equity into their performance management processes?
Sure. Again, I'll stick with twos. I have two that I think are particularly important. Uh, the first is, again, going back to kind of the idea that I think uh, is fundamental. I think Michael's really picking up on as well, is that there is going to be these ups and downs, and so setting yourself up for success by recognizing that kind of organizational learning perspective. So what that means then in terms of a practical tool, I think very often we don't want to. There's a feeling that you need to solve the equity problem and implement, and that was actually when I started doing research in this area. That was certainly my perspective. But really, the reality of it is, especially early on, the tool to use is pilot programs. So pilot programs that have some sort of limited time frame that you can evaluate, that you can learn from, that are deliberately set up to learn is really fundamental. I think that's going to be critical. More recently, I've started working on some work with the IBM Business of Government folks, looking at performance auditing. And performance auditing is a nifty. You could think of it as a tool, and it is a nifty tool, I think, to advance equity within an organization when done properly, because it sort of sets up this external um, process that is established within the organization, and it provides a very explicit opportunity for feedback. It provides a formal time frame for integrating changes and recommendations. And so, again, all under the framework of organizational learning. I think those are two very strong tools, implementing pilot programs and empowering the local audit shop to think about equity and think about evaluating conducting all their performance audits through the lens of equity. I think are two very powerful tools for deeply embedding equity in public organizations.
One of the things that we've been doing, it was promoted in our original equity social justice strategic plan, was participatory budgeting. We've run them as pilots. So using the pilot concept has been important, and it hasn't been simple. I think we've had some successes, but it's been complex in terms of getting volunteers to participate, understanding how a basic budgeting process works, and then also understanding how much things cost to put in that park bench that you thought should be $100. Turns out it's 4,000, and there's maintenance issues. No one in the community really wants to know all that detail, but those are the kinds of things that you have to understand in order to budget for things along those lines. I I again support Benoit's efforts, suggestions here. I have three additional things. One is one I already alluded to is disaggregated data by demographics. I think overall, King County looks amazing. Like our average wealth, we're highly educated, all these great indicators. But when you disaggregate that same data, you realize how disparate your experience can be in King County. You have the Bill Gateses and you have people who are living 10, 15 years less, and you have people that are, don't have a high school degree and they're making $40,000 on a good year, which is only half of what you need in order to have a house in this county. So, the disaggregation of data by race, place, um, income is really an essential tool for the data people. Uh, I do think we'll talk a little bit about equity specific measures, but I think there are some specific measures you can create around equity. I tend to think of employment, procurement, other internal services that the county provides, customer experience. If you're collecting customer experience data and people of one race or another are having a better or worse experience, that may not be random, right? There might be something in what we're doing and what we're saying to our customers, or how we're training our customer service facing folks. Um, so those are things where we need to look at, how we're operating. Last, I also mentioned the equity impact review tool. This is something I think we originally picked up from Seattle. We've had a version of it for a number of years. We're in the process of revisiting it again. And this basically asks you to go through a series of routine questions about any project and ask who's benefiting, who is not benefiting. Are there specific subpopulations that are going to be impacted through this idea? It could be putting a solid waste transfer station in the community. It could be seen as a positive thing. Maybe there's a park. So if we have $5 million for a park, where it goes maybe should go through one of these equity impact review processes so that we understand who's missing park space or what types of parks are needed in certain communities. So uh, I would say we're not systematic at this point in the use of equity impact reviews, but we are doing them. We just we're in the middle of our budget process for this next year, and several departments mentioned that they did equity impact reviews on proposals. And the goal would then be to modify your original idea to better reflect, minimize equity impacts and maximize, the benefit for different communities. So those would be some of the kinds of tools that I would suggest.
Thank you. Are there specific indicators or metrics that help assess the progress of equity in performance management?
Sure. I'll just keep going with this. I'll go first. Michael will go second, kind of drill, because I think so. I think one of the again, I'm sort of going to sound a little bit redundant, I suppose. Given the perspective of this report, the ICME report that I wrote around organizational change, the difference I add to this conversation about metrics is that there's one set of metrics that people often go to, which is the outcome or the output, right, of the program. So they want to understand if their program is equitable, if it's leading to equitable outcomes in the community. And of course, that is the ultimate goal, so that makes perfect sense. But there's also a level of measuring equity success just in terms of the organization, right? So you can actually, again, if you're thinking about a performance audit of the organization, you would ask the questions of, are there tools in all the departments that allow for equity to be measured? Is there data, disaggregated data, available in the organization to subsequently measure equity? So even I think so before jumping ahead to just thinking about equity success in terms of outputs and outcomes, there's a set of metrics that allow you to think about whether your organization is actually being successful in adopting equity itself. And then I imagine Michael will hit on some of this as well. Um, One of the things I heard pretty loud and clear, and it's not surprising, Michael mentioned it earlier as well, is that the quantitative data is super important, but they're just given the nature of equity, there's a real benefit to supplementing that with sort of the qualitative data, which takes a different level of effort and time and commitment to sort of gathering and compiling and then telling that story. So, Michael.
Yeah, I think if you put an equity frame on, you start seeing you already have a lot of this data. Now, you don't have all the data. You never have all the data that you want, but you start seeing, you know, that your GIS system already has disparity data baked into where the parks are, where are the wastewater treatment, pump stations, all the sort of positive and negative externalities of government. Who's getting the bus services? Are those going through specific census tracts? Are they benefiting people with low income? Um, how how regular are those buses running versus other areas? So there's a lot of information that you're already collect. I'm going to guarantee that most governments are already collecting. They just haven't maybe stepped back and said, "Is there an equity framing on this that we need to be looking at?" So that's the hard answer, but it's actually the easy answer because there's no actually new data. There's just a kind of reframing of the data that you have. I also think, we did an employee survey. Many governments do this, looking at those data by gender, looking at those data by race, or even white versus people of color. I'm going to guarantee you're going to see differences in response. Those are places to start a conversation about what do we need to be doing to address why these differences exist. And so that's more internal workforce kind of thing. I mentioned procurement before. How much money is going out to minority or women-owned businesses, for example, small, medium-sized businesses? These are things that there are often state, federal standards that you can draw from. Hard to get the benchmark data on this, but in general, you can set some internal goals for what you're doing. I think the other piece that I would throw out there is the community level data, while not as useful for measuring operational performance, is interesting and worthwhile for people to look at from a strategic perspective. So if you go to King County's website, and there's a site called there's a project called Determinants of Equity. This is built off the health equity model. Determinants of health. We identify quite a few specific indicators of community well-being for and by race and by geography. And you'll see, again, even in King County, we have there's no consistency across race for almost any of those indicators. So you're looking at educational outcomes, you're looking at income outcomes, home ownership outcomes, any number of indicators. Those aren't something that I can walk back to my desk and say, "Oh, I'm going to do this today as a result of that." But when that equity strategic plan is being built, you better, or your county strategic plan, your city strategic plan, that's an incredible data source. All the data on that, very little of that is from the county. It's mostly federal data that we've just pulled down to the county and census block level. So these are almost all external data sources. Again, that took a person well over a year to put that together. That's not a small project, but there are other data. There's other equity atlases out there, not just for a specific county. And there's many other examples where you might be able to draw some data to identify what are the priority issues you should be addressing.
Thank you. I just want to remind folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the questions and answer chat on the top right. And we actually do have one question, so I'm going to move to that. How does your organization, or can an organization, think about equity in the sense of working from home or allowing for hybrid structuring? The person who asked the question said, I think this has become a barrier when allowing staff to work from home with the knowledge that not all roles can efficiently do work away from the office and may seem unfair when allowing for these types of work balance benefits.
I'll let Michael take that one. That's pretty.
We're right in the middle of this discussion. Many people never went home during the pandemic, right? Wastewater operators cannot operate wastewater plants from home. Bus drivers cannot drive a bus from home. So something like 70-80% of our county workforce never went, worked away from their workspace. We are currently working through exactly what our approach to this will be, but there is currently a move to get more folks back into the office, at least part of the week. I do think it is an equity issue because many of the folks that never had a choice to work from home are often they're blue collar positions. They may be lower paid positions, and so there's definitely some disgruntlement there, like, hey, I never had the choice because of the nature of my job. So I don't know that that answers the question, but I think it's a fair question worth struggling with.
Benoit, any insight?
No, I don't have much to add on that one. It's a new one for me.
No worries. Um, Another question is, how would you address equity in performance appraisals and reviews?
Super. This question, this so much of this for me, I think is, and for at least again the folks that I've been speaking with, is so the question is kind of framed as on the output side, what does it look like in the appraisal? But really, what sets that up is what do you understand success in equity to be? And that's a very challenging question that I don't know that the field has generally addressed. As Michael suggested, and he may have some answers given their extensive conversations, but it requires a great deal of upfront thinking about what are we stepping into and how will we know that we're successful. And again, when I ask the question of public administrators and equity officers, what does it mean to be successful in this space? The answer very universally wasn't actually on the outcome or output side, but it was that we know we're successful in this space when when it is integrated in the day-to-day activities and everyone in the organization recognizes it as a value in the same way that they recognize the importance of efficiency and effectiveness and so forth. And so what that looks like in a performance appraisal that is not targeted on the organization is a little bit hard for me to address. I imagine, that people will have some ideas about how their programmatic efforts ought to be applied equitably, but I'm not sure, other than the broader sense of, hey, it ought to be part of that day-to-day decision making, what it looks like in the appraisal. So that's where I would frame it from, is that really first it's about thinking and being clear about what you understand success in equity looks like, and then to the degree you're moving in that direction, I would frame it in the organizational perspective of is our organization really recognizing this as a core value that is determining how we do our work and subsequently measure things.
I think there's a lot that we can discover about the answer here, because I think it's not cookbook yet. I'm in the middle of performance evaluation season. Very timely question. And in our office, we do two things. One is we try to bake in equity related skills, trainings, and kind of project management into the progression in our executive analyst function. So equity executive analyst one, some ability to do some things, but by the time you are moving up, you are taking on equity project, which we acknowledge are often more complex than a standard budget project or performance measurement project. So we're looking for expansion of people's abilities and skills in order for them to be promoted. On the annual basis, we have the county's goals um, in our performance appraisal, and each of those goals has a number of behaviors associated, positive behaviors, and essentially the manager and the employee go through and say, which of these are you exemplary in, and which are these are an opportunity for improvement, and equity is included in there as one of those. Things like we recognize our positional power, how it affects our interactions. We act as champions to achieve racial justice. So, I have one employee who's going to put that down as a topic where they feel like they're excelling. They're in the leadership role. I have other folks where that might be a gap, and that we actually want them to take some additional training and skill building in that area. So we use it more as a kind of an evaluative framework along with the other goals. We're customer oriented, we achieve results. There's a whole bunch of these. And so it's more of a menu to pick from. It's not a required thing that everyone, we have gone through phases where like everyone should have an equity related development goal, for example. I don't think we're doing that this year, but those kinds of there's even I would say there's initiatives within the initiative, right? So let's focus on equity improvement at the individual level. That happens, and we've seen some progress. We've seen some pushback on it too, but overall, people understand the need to build their skills out in this area because it's not optional anymore. It is part of how we do our work. And if you don't know how to use Excel, or you don't know how to, critique a project from an equity perspective, you're not going to be successful. So both of those, they're not equal, but I mean, they are both important for professional development.
Thank you. Another question here is, what do you think the impact of AI will be on equity in public management?
Hmm.
Uh, great question. I was at and this is less based on my research as much as sort of having attended a few other seminars where they talked about AI in public management and issues around equity. And of course, I think I'm not an AI expert by any stretch, but I think you know equity in public organizations, as I think Michael's been alluding to, and I've been saying, is it's data, right? So much of this can be driven by data, but AI, good, bad data in, bad data out, right? And so I think one of the things we are seeing still in at least the generative AI is that it's drawing very often uh, on on the loudest sorts of parts of the internet, which can often be inequitable and biased and so forth. And so, trying to understand or being clear about sort of what the limits of AI are currently, just given the nature of the data that exists out there. And so, then to Michael's earlier point about one of the real challenges is developing those underlying data sets that are disaggregated and accurate reflections is going to be critical for I think employing AI effectively in the future.
I'm probably not the best guy to ask about this because I'm a bit of a technophobe. I might even be called a Luddite by some, but I think if you are entering into an AI conversation and equity is not either in the sentence or in the immediately following sentence, you are doing a disservice to the field of public administration. I think the risks of AI using the data sets that exist, the history that exists, presents many high risk scenarios. I would say that right now my county seems to be taking a very conservative approach, and the policy around around using AI came out from our CIO and our director of Office of Equity, Racial, and Social Justice jointly. And the concerns were as much about release of county and public data. So it was as much security concerns than it was about the warping and equity contorting impact of AI itself, although I think that was a factor. I think if you're in a situation and people are only talking about AI and all the things it's going to do for you and all the toast it's going to butter for you, please be that person and say, well, what are the equity implications for the use of this tool? I think it is essential for people that um, the technologists are so in love with this approach that they are not slowing down for anything, whether it's security or equity. Security may catch their attention a little bit more, but I think the equity impacts are worrisome. It's not to say we can't use it or there won't be useful applications or things like that, but I think it's a very appropriate question to ask in light of the equity history, in our country and the history of equity on the internet. And what are the data sources? If your data sources are skewed, you're going to get a skewed result. So it is a little bit, it is worrisome. I guess I will be cautious at this point.
Thank you both so much. As we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts, advice, anything that you'd like to say to our audience regarding this topic or anything else?
Well, you know, depending on who the audience is, I suppose. I can't see who's there exactly. But in terms of public administration in general, right? I mean, if we thought about the practitioner side of it, I think recognize that. I mean, Michael's says he's been at this for a long time, and there's still lots to figure out. Equity is a long game, and so having your public organization commit to this is committing to a marathon, and that requires the willingness to work through tough times. It requires strong leadership, and it requires just the willingness and to understand there's going to be these sort of pitfalls as you move along, because we haven't figured it all out. On the academic side, then this means, hey, we've got work to do, right? There's lots to figure out. The I think the probably the lesson I would give to my academic colleagues is that there is such great and innovative work, though, being done by local governments, by practitioners, and I don't think it's been well captured in the literature. And so I would highly advise or recommend to my colleagues that they spend a lot of time looking to the work that's happening, and drawing on the expertise of our practitioner colleagues, because I think that's where a lot of the exciting work around equity is currently being done. Thank you for the time today.
I'll just say there was a comment made earlier about how far along we are or whatever. I will tell you, there's not a single person I work with at King County that says the same thing. We only see what's in front of us. We do not see the pavement we've come over, the path that we've cut. And I think, in a sense, I want to say that in an inspiring way, in that this is still an emergent field of practice. Racism has been around for a few thousand years, so that's a well-established practice. But challenging public administration and government to overcome racism and these impacts in our community is still relatively new. It is not widespread in every government. Not every school requires that you study it. I think this is, in a sense, this is shooting fish in a barrel. There are so many opportunities to learn and push the field. Whether you're academic, if you're a student, please orient one of your papers towards this topic. Develop those skills. There's not a person that we hire in our office. Granted, it's the budget office. Maybe they don't ask it, to be a bus driver, but every person that we interview it will have an equity question. And there's not necessarily, quote, the right answer, but it's how do you think about this? How do you position yourself? How do you understand your own privilege and, positional power in a office like an OMB? And understanding that becomes critical to your long-term success here. So I think there's research opportunity, there's implementation opportunity, and there's teaching and sharing opportunities. Groups like ASPA, groups like GARE, Government Alliance for Race and Equity, many groups are out there that are trying to move the needle on this. So I'd encourage you to get involved. And again, as I said at the beginning, been one of the most rewarding professional things that I've been working on in my professional career.
Thank you both so much for this incredibly engaging conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at ncpp@suffolk.edu. I believe that's in the chat. And stay in touch. And thank you all for coming.
Yep. And on ASPA side, again, we just want to thank our speakers today for their expertise in sharing this engaging content. We really appreciate it, especially in a free capacity. I think that's something that's really rare nowadays to find quality digital content that's willing to be given for free. So we definitely appreciate that. A recording of this session will be available to members. It'll be in your online portal in the digital content library. If you're not an ASPA member, you can reach out to membership at aspanet.org. And if you'd like to reach out to the speakers in the chat, there is a link to their email. If you don't have the chat, it's ncpp at Suffolk, SUFFOLK, .edu, so that you can follow up with the speakers directly that way. And then the membership is for ASPA only, so that will come directly to us. So I'd like to thank our speakers again and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.